The notion that you're going to increase access for the severely handicapped and disabled is very important. 2 or 3 of the other changes I think are important, and I think will be watched by the rest of the country very carefully. So I think you're already at the edge of a more activist approach to this than many other Canadian jurisdictions. One of our political problems, I use that term advisedly, is that folks who are on low income, marginalized, and excluded don't vote. Now, would it surprise you when we know from our own studies in other parts of the country that a homeless person on the street spends 88% of his or her time to figure out what they're going to eat for dinner, where they're going to get it, and where they're going to sleep, that they're not actively involved in the political process? Haven't found time to join the political party or lobby group of their choice? Who would be surprised at that? And there's a great book done by John Galbraith some years ago called The Comfortable Few, which talks about how in the American system, American politicians have responded to the people who vote and contribute and are part of the process, which leaves everybody else out of the mix. So part of our political problem is, A, not to keep on talking to each other, because I think we're already convinced about poverty and how critical a problem it is, but how to broaden that discussion. And one of the ways we can broaden it, I would argue, is to talk about how expensive it is to leave poverty addressed the way it is now. When we know that our hospitals fill up with poor people and we are complaining about how expensive health care is, and we know the hospitals are the most expensive part, in some measure, of the delivery system, then we know that if we reduce the rates of poverty, we'd actually have more flexibility in our health care budgets. And if we know that the prison system, which is wildly overpopulated by low-income people and our First Nations brothers and sisters, well beyond the percentage of the population, we know that if we fought poverty, which is the greatest predictor of showing up in a prison, at an early age, we would reduce some of those costs. And when we know that dropping out of school is predicted fundamentally by poverty, poor families have that problem far more than others, and we know what a dropout ends up costing the system, we know that if we deal with poverty, we can reduce some of those costs in a way that is more productive and more humane. Talk about Calgary. So none of us here Calgary is a hotbed of socialism. Right? Wouldn't be the first thing that comes to mind. But what did they discover in Calgary? They discovered that while in London, England, 250 people slept on the street every night, in Calgary, that number was 500. Right? And they discovered that they were putting 2,500 people a night into shelters run by the Sally Ann and others. And the province was contributing $40 a head per night. So that's 365 times 2,500 times 40. And that's a lot of money that actually could be going to providing real housing for real people. And the average cost, by the way, there were some real massive examples in the States, but the average cost, by the way, for a homeless person on the street comes into contact on occasion with the law, runs into other difficulties, 911 kinds of difficulties, ends up in the emergency room because there's nowhere else to be. You begin to get a number of between 80 to 120,000 a year. You can actually do a lot of real good housing for way less. So in Calgary, and I take this as an example, because I think it's important we find a way to bring the left and the right together on this. We can't actually afford the divisions between those who care about economic growth and those who care about equality of opportunity. We have to bring people together. In Calgary, their foundation for homelessness was started by a retired chairman of Imperial Oil, not a member of the Communist Party of Canada, I hasten to add. Why? Because they decided this was really bad business. And they put together NGOs, church, the police were delighted to be helpful. The police would rather not be dealing with essentially innocent people who are on the street and get into trouble. They have enough trouble dealing with other folks. And they set a goal to eradicate homelessness. Not fix it, not make it better, not help folks who don't have homes, but to eradicate it in 10 years. And they came up with a definition. The definition is nobody stays in a shelter for more than 7 days before they get a real place to live. End of story. Right? And after year one, they're at 15% of their goal in terms of new housing stock and converted apartments and bed sitting rooms and the kinds of facilities in which people can live. And they established an operating rule. Housing first. So all the things here, you can't put a psychotic person in an apartment. Well, really? Better than on the street? Right? You can't put somebody who has a medical condition in an apartment. Why? Why can't you do that? Why are they not better off if they have a clean place to sleep, shower every day, get some stability in their lives? So that tells you that people who care about our economy and how it generates jobs are beginning to understand that poverty is not somebody else's problem. So what Senator Eggleton, who is a Liberal, and I are saying across the country in defense of our report is this is not about how much more we need to spend. This is about how badly we are spending what we already spend. And just so you know, taxpayers all, $160 billion a year spent by federal, provincial, territorial governments on transfers to people, not counting education and healthcare. Right? Those are aside. And yet we haven't moved the rate of poverty in the downward direction at all in a quarter of a century. Senator David Kroll, who did the first inquiry, and he was a Liberal some many years ago, said in 1971 to the Empire Club in Toronto, if this were a business, and we were spending all this money with so little success, we'd be firing a lot of people and trying something new, because this would be bankrupt. And in my judgment, that's where we are. Now, I argue that poverty is job one because it's essentially about who now lives in poverty. 75% or more of the people who live under the poverty line are single mothers. So when you hear we can't fix this because the pathologies are very different, it's very complex, actually, it's not. And what you often hear from people is, you know why you can't fix poverty? Because poverty is the result of a whole bunch of complex things. It's the result of family breakup. It's the result of low birth rates. It's the result of fetal alcohol syndrome. It's the result of school dropouts. It's the result, right? And of course they array that so that we say, well, we can't fix all of that. That's way too complex. And it's not true. Poverty is not a result. Poverty is a cause. And we can fix poverty. And when I tell you how, and share for you to consider today, try to think you're sitting in a room in 1960 and someone standing in front of you and saying, we can have universal health care in this country. Right? And think of all the folks who will tell you why we can't, why we couldn't, why it would never work. Because that's where I think we are now on the issue of poverty.